Great, so thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy LaViers, and this is my colleague, Kat Maguire. We are going to trade off here a little bit for our activity for this workshop. This is a demonstration of movement analysis, and we work with the Robotics, Automation, and Dance Lab, trying to help people connect technology and movement analysis. I'm going to start off with a few slides that give you sort of an intellectual frame, and then Kat's going to lead us through an interactive activity that we hope, this is all pre-recorded, but we hope that you will join us for in your own space. And then I'll close with a few more slides that kind of bring this back to research in movement and labeling of the meaning of movement. So we'll get started. This is the question that Kat and I and our colleagues in movement analysis think about all the time, right? The idea that movement seems to express information. We typically think about this in human beings. So on the right side of this slide, you see dancers who are coordinating with one another to create a formation, express an idea of a choreographer. In the lower right corner, you see these two men, both making very similar postures, but because of the different context that we see those postures in, we interpret a very different meaning. One looks like they're in help, asking for help, and one looks like they're jumping for joy. We also see similar behaviors like this through animals. We know that fish school by watching the motion of neighboring fish. Somehow they're exchanging information through that motion, creating this global coordination. We know that we think that octopuses seem intelligent based on the way that they interact in their environment. And this is something that biologists engage in all the time, looking at the motion of new or unknown or species that they're studying, watching the movement and trying to make meaning out of it. So let's talk about that. What does that mean if movement expresses information? So the way we like to look at this in our research is really through Shannon's model of communication. What does it mean to communicate information? He developed this sort of three-part model that I'm going to kind of simplify and abstract to talk about the process through which we make meaning from motion, which is similar to the process that we make meaning from information. So the first piece of that is that we have a source. We have a moving body. It may be a robot. It may be an animated avatar. It may be another human being that is moving in space. And if it has complex movement patterns available to it, it's a richer source than if it can only do one or two things, right? We know that from Shannon's work. The transmission of that happens over a channel. And I like to think of that channel as, often in information theory, we think of it as a source for noise, but here it's really a source for context and environment. And just like one channel may be lossier than another channel, a particular context may be quite charged and change what the source behavior might mean to the third part, which is this blue block, our receiver. This is usually a human being, but sometimes it may be an algorithm that's trying to analyze a particular movement example. And this is now its own subsystem that has its own decoding scheme, that has its own set of, we often say, biases in how it views and sees movement, what it notices and what it places a large amount of meaning, a large amount of emphasis and weight on. And we think of the arts and dance and movement as really a test bed to understand how these three parts interact. And so that's what we're going to try and simulate for you guys today. And we'll start with a seemingly innocuous exercise. And so Kat and I are going to play along with this and pretend that we're simulating our audience here. The question, Kat, is, are these the same? And we'll watch the video maybe one more time. We could argue both for yes and no, right? So often someone will argue for yes. They seem like they're doing the same things. They're moving the same body parts in the same order. One thing we might notice is that there's a temporal sort of asynchronization that happens at the beginning, and then here at the end, they seem to be in sync again. Do you see this moment here where Varun extends his arm first and then Joel extends his arm? So because it looks like they're doing the same thing left to right, we notice that the timing seems to be somewhat off at the beginning and then synchronized at the end. Now, that might be one beginning of an argument for why they're not the same. At the beginning, they're not perfectly synchronized, so these things then aren't the same. Okay, well, the other issue with being the same is that Joel is about 6'3" and Varun is about 5'7", and the height of Joel's ears and the length of Joel's forearms are different than that of Varun. So it's actually quite amazing that we could even make an argument that these two very distinct mechanical bodies are doing the same thing, and yet it seems like maybe they are. Which way do you vote? Are they? If you can only vote yes or no, you say yes or no. Kat?
I would say yes.
I think through the and I kind of agree with that. I think they are doing the same thing. But so let's look at one more example. Are these the same? And I'll let you at home, if you're watching this recording, what do you think? Are these the same? This is where it starts to get a little wrinkly, and it's actually a little hard maybe to answer that here, or there's similarly an argument for both here. I often get laughs at that moment. So when Varun, when Joel snaps his fingers and when Manav right here, that moment, usually if I have a large audience, a few people may laugh. Why is that moment funny? Well, I think this question of are they the same? Here, one is snapping his fingers, a recognition moment that we know, we see that often as almost a stereotype gesture. And then the other is flicking his hands towards the sky, but with a similar motion quality, right? And similarly here at the end, they end in a similar physical place. How do we unravel this mystery of why two movement sequences that now seem quite different body parts are moving at the same time? They now seem more synchronized in time than the previous pair, which makes no sense because they're moving different body parts. And so they aren't obviously doing the same thing, but then there are these moments of real synergy and synchrony and sameness that read, for me at least as a movement viewer and often for audience members. So here we have this arc-like extension, this gathering, this snap, this flick, and then this ending low. So through those abstractions that I named and made it seem like I came up with, but I didn't because these come from Laban movement analysis, we can start to analyze that. So Kat, maybe you can go through these four concepts from the four areas of the Laban-Bartenieff movement system.
Sure. So why we would argue that they are doing the same thing is evidenced in this, what we call motif, which is a form of representing big movement ideas in symbolic language that allows us to find commonality as well as difference. In this particular sequence, we can immediately identify that there are four parts. So that would be the baseline argument that they are the same. They're each doing a four-part sequence. We can also identify that the idea behind each of their movement choices is also the same. So the first symbol in the motif is what we call arc-like directional mode of shape change, which usually deals with this notion of arcing through the space of the kinesphere in some kind of bridging activity or not, but they're both doing that. And you can see that the one dancer is doing that with one arm, the other is doing it with two, but they're both doing an arc-like directional movement. The second action that they're both engaging in is this notion of gather, which is pulling toward, some action of coming toward self, coming toward the body. And again, they're doing this differently, and yet they're both gathering. They're gathering in different parts of their kinesphere, but both are using their arms to gather toward themselves. The gesture of the snap as well as the hands is what we call a flick. And we're identifying that as having a basic shared quality of expression, which in the Laban terminology is a combination of light weight effort, indirect space effort, and quick time. So again, even though one dancer is doing it with one hand and a snap, and the other is doing it with two hands going upward, they're both engaging in a similar expressive quality that reveals that idea of what we call flick. And finally, they're both changing their location in space. And so the final symbol in this motif is a space symbol, which indicates place low. And again, that's relative to the mover. So Joel is choosing to go place low by also having a little bit of a forward element, whereas the other dancer is choosing to just directly go down to place low. But again, we can see that they're both changing their location in space towards the direction, toward the pull of place low. So when we look at it in this regard, where we see the motif and we see their movements, we can say they're doing the same thing.
Even though they're obviously doing something completely different.
Right.
This is a fun example because yes, they're both doing the same thing and they're not both doing the same thing, just as in the more similar synchronized initial example. So
correct.
Thank you for walking us through that. That is our miniature crash course in Laban movement analysis for today. We're now gonna break from the slides and kind of get into our interactive moment. I'm gonna put us side by side in gallery view. So we're creating a simulated space. And if you're watching this video at home, we invite you to create a little space for yourself and move with us. This is a core component of how we teach the Laban movement and methodology is by moving. And I have to adjust my screen a little bit, I can already tell. So, shall we begin with arc-like mode of shape change?
Sure. I'm going to do this.
Oh, okay. I am going to make mine a little more subtle, and I'm just going to take my spine and arc it as if there's a person standing right here, and I'm reaching almost to that lamp behind me and arcing in space with my spine. So that's,
okay.
we're now creating our own sequence from these same four movement ideas, so we now have more sequences.
So arc-like into gather.
Oh, we did a similar thing. I'll gather with my leg and my arm. So 3 limbs gathering in.
And I'm just doing 2. So now we have arc-like, gather, and we're going to add flick.
That's mine. My nose to the ceiling. Flick.
And mine is my head and ear to the side.
Great. So we're both flicking with our head, same body part, but different spatial orientations to the way we're engaging. Cool.
Which changes the expression and what the viewer perceives. But we're still doing the same thing. So now we have arc-like, gather, flick, and place low.
So I'll do mine in sort of like a small reach space. So I'm just going to end a little bit low, and you're ending all the way low, but we're both indicating the same spatial pull.
We are both responding to the same spatial pull, but we're using a different portion of our kinesphere or our personal space to express that pull. So we now have the same phrase that we're each doing, and they look like this side by side. Ready? So,
cool.
Are we doing the same thing?
I thought we were pretty synchronous.
Yeah. Now, one thing we can play with, because we often talk about how movement comes to have meaning. And meaning is often understood in context and in phrasing. What happened before and what happened after tells the story of the movement. And it doesn't have to be a literal meaning, but it still has an impact on the viewer and an impact on the environment that can be the same and different. So one thing I'm going to ask us to do now is look at, as you saw what we just did, we were moving temporally very similarly. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask each of us to change somewhere in our phrase the timing. And let's look at that just side by side and see if you can identify at home, the viewer, what each of us changed and how that changed how we look together side by side. So we're going to just play with changing the timing.
So wait, I have to think a little bit what I'm doing.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready.
Ready?
Yep.
Go. So one thing hopefully you'll notice is that simply by changing the timing of the movement, we haven't changed the movement, we haven't changed the sequence of the movement, we're both still doing the same phrase. But by changing the timing, the meaning of that phrase, the expression of that phrase changes. So for example, what I changed was I took a really long time to do this. And that gives a different story than this.
Mm-hmm. And it felt different. So for me, it felt much more actually textured, because when we first did it, we were both kind of doing like the same, like default little evenly timed lengths for each of the 4 movements. And so then by choosing some, they felt really sculptural and slow and maybe even, you know, emoted, like more into my feeling and into my body. And then others felt very quick and more decorative. So I think for me, the phrase felt more interesting as a mover, and I would think probably as a viewer too. So that's
right, because as we begin to vary the timing and the length that things take, that again changes the expressive quality or the tone that is perceived in what the story of the movement is.
Even though here we're in a very like plain environment and these movements seem rather narrativeless, we could imagine that there's like people moving around us, or we're in an interesting environment where all of a sudden these abstract phrases could take on quite a literal story. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's play with another idea. As Amy already alluded to, when we originally built the phrase and showed you us building the phrase, we were really doing every action took about the same amount of time, and it was all very even. And so there was no real privileging of any movement over another. So now I'm going to ask us to privilege one part of the phrase as being the most important, the most emphasis. And again, we're going to keep doing the same phrase, but we're going to pick one part of it and make it super important. And let's see how that changes the narrative. Ready? What did you see?
Oh, I had a hard time seeing us both at the same time.
I know.
I saw that it ended in a very, because you went lower more quickly, which partly changed the quality of that last movement. It almost looked like it almost looked like a prelude now. Like the action is going to begin now. I'm perched and ready to maybe attack, maybe celebrate, I'm not quite sure, but something was about to happen at the end of the phrase for me now.
Right. So the emphasis was on the end, which.
Oh my gosh, that's the one I picked too. Oh gosh, that's funny.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't even really register the first three that you did probably.
Right. Because everything was building up to that last moment. And so again, that then changes the role and the relationship of the preceding movement as being into bringing it to the end.
And so for what I kind of made my little spine wiggle and my gather and my flick much more pedestrian and almost like maybe I was scratching an itch. And then I just did this really low, which what felt to me kind of ominous ending moment. That was my choreographic intent anyway, that it would be sort of this like ominous, like all of a sudden I got upset about something.
Yeah. And like you said, my thinking was I was sort of preparing the space to then take me.
Cool.
And so it had some of that sort of predatory kind of feeling, like everything was just building to that last moment where I was ready to go. So that would be some way what we related to what we call phrasing, and where accent and emphasis occurs. So now what for me, part of what's happening now is, are we doing the same thing? Yes. Are we doing the same thing? No. Because as we continue to refine our personal expression of the sequence, we're moving further and further apart in some ways from each other than what it looked like when we first showed it to you and we were just doing everything together in the same timing. So phrasing influences meaning and perceived experience of movement as well. And then finally, how you're viewing the movement, the actual location of the movement in the environment will also change it. So let's do it one last time, changing our organization in relationship to the Zoom camera in space, and see what that does. Ready?
Yes.
Okay, go.
I think I took too many liberties, but that's okay. We can.
But what that little moment was hopefully revealing was that there's also a relationship. The primary fundamental relationship is the body in space, and where we are in space and what space we're using in relationship to the audience or the environment that we're in will also change the meaning and the experience of the expression.
And it made me want to change the movement immediately. So as a mover that I was watching the Zoom screen, like all of a sudden I was like, oh, like now I want to twist here. And now it made it hard for me to keep the exercise pure in that moment, because then I was like, oh, I'm at this new orientation, and wouldn't it be cool if I because if I do this, they won't even see me do it because now my back is to them. So the performer in me kind of messed up the purity of the experiment and trying to think, oh, well, how do I want to arrange myself?
And that also raises an issue that's really interesting to think about as we move through these workshops, is the performative aspect of movement. Who are we moving for? Are we moving for our own experience? Are we moving to show or tell something? Are we moving to connect to someone and create a particular kind of interaction with them? And again, all of those choices will change the experience both of the mover and of the observer. The observer will have a different experience as those different things are manipulated as well.
Which is a perfect segue back to our model. Now we're thinking of all three of those pieces, and I'll just take it back to our slides to finish up. So these are a way of phrasing these pieces that Kat is talking about, which are really classical elements in any sort of performing arts space where you're thinking about creating a show that expresses a particular idea or set of ideas. We played around with the source. We changed how we were moving. We changed the choices we were making. We changed the context a little bit. We didn't go as far as to like make virtual Zoom backgrounds, although that would be fun. But we did change where we were in space and how we were relating to the environment and how that changed both the experience as movers and also hopefully as you're watching us move or as you're experiencing it, you see how it might change how an audience member or a counterpart or a colleague at work would view the way you're moving. And then we talked also about how often it looks like people are doing the same thing when they aren't. Often it looks like people are doing different things when actually there's more of a common thread that upon further analysis, we see that commonality. And that's not so much about the physical sameness or exactness, but it's about this perception that we have as viewers and observers. And we've kind of teased all those three pieces out. To give an example of some research that we've done applying these same ideas, in the Rad Lab, we took these previously generated movement phrases. They're actually different walking styles. And animators created these walking styles to match the prompts of the labels given by the researchers. So they had to make a neutral walking style, a happy walking style, sad, energetic, tired, feminine, masculine. We took those videos of those walking styles that the previous researchers had used, and they had used these white backgrounds. So they had kind of kept them in a very neutral context. And we took them and we put them in all these crazy environments. So we took, you know, the feminine style is on the beach here in the upper left corner, and the happy style is walking through a field of garbage on the right. On the lower left, we see the neutral style, but in a very dark and moody field. On the lower right, we see the tired walking style in a sort of befitting war scene where there's some other soldiers walking with this very tired heaviness as well. And then we asked people how they would label them. And the big result of that is the results from the original researchers don't hold up in this new sort of remixed environment. So we took these 7 animations, put them on 7 different backgrounds. We create 49 videos. And what you see here in red is mostly, which is our new user group picked labels that contradicted the animator intent. Mostly, that's what happened. That's the red that you see. If we start to look, there's a little bit more structure to the data if we look over here on the right set of graphs, where I look at what the happy sequence was labeled. The happy sequence was rarely labeled happy. In fact, it was more frequently labeled feminine than happy. And so you see that this highly charged emotive label really breaks down across different contexts, because happy is really a thing that might be true right now and then not true so much later, and it's really dependent on our environment. Whereas the masculine walking sequence, which you see down here as I move my cursor around in the lower right set of those right-handed graphs, it was frequently, almost always labeled masculine. So this idea of these wide set, bouldering, kind of outdated stereotype, but known stereotype nonetheless, was really effective, and users frequently labeled it as being the masculine walking sequence, regardless of what environment they saw it in. So this kind of shows this same idea that as we change the context of a particular, we take the same walking sequence and we put it in these new environments, the meaning of the motion changes for people. We can use this to improve our prediction of how people will label things and how people will see meaning. And so the way we did this was using a linear model. We used a 2-part model of affect, valence, and arousal in each of these, first for the environments and then for the walking sequences. And using a very simple linear model that actually, I won't get into too much of the detail, but you can see just from the coefficients that the top row here is our valence, positive or negative, the left to right axis, and then the bottom row is our arousal, where we don't have as good of a spread of data, and so we don't have as much interesting we have very small coefficients for that layer, but it actually takes the walking sequence affect and the valence, the walking sequence valence, positive or negative, and the environment valence, positive or negative, as equally important to this model when we use both the location and the movement style itself to predict how people will label it. So some research coming out of the lab that sort of applies this to some quantitative modeling and prediction of how people will assign labels to novel scenes as you start mixing the background and the motion. Again, how do we make meaning from motion? It's not so universal. It has all of these different moving parts, and it really requires a lot of analysis, a lot of getting up and moving yourself to start to unravel and understand how these parts work. So thank you for joining me, Kat. Here's the great.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Well, I think 2018 maybe.
Yeah.
So thank you all for watching. We appreciate being a part of James's workshop today, and we look forward. You could reach us over email or through James. I'm LaViers@gmail.
Kat Maguire 83 at Gmail.
And so we look forward to connecting with this community in person on the 23rd.
Yep. Great. Thank you for watching.